Well, it's 2 o'clock, so I guess we'll get started now. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our RiseOut Synergy session, Census 2020. I'm happy to present that this is presented by the Center for Law and Social Justice, the New York Immigration Coalition, NALEO, and the LGBT Community Center. But before I get into the heart of the presentation, I want to introduce myself. My name is Aaron Sanders. I'm the Outreach and Organizing Coordinator at the LGBT Center in New York City. And I will be facilitating today. So first off, we want to thank you all for joining us for this really important special webinar, which we hope is insightful, informative, engaging, and relieving. Now, you might ask yourself, why would this be relieving? We understand that a lot of people are dealing with stress due to this coronavirus pandemic, and we want this next hour to serve as a forum where folks can feel a sense of relief. I'm sorry, if you can mute yourself, that would be great. So we want this webinar to serve as a space for community members to engage in topics that they care about. So with that being said, we will segue. So there's a few housekeeping items that we want to speak about, a few processes. First thing first, this webinar is being recorded. And in an effort to give all the presenters our undivided attention, folks who are not speaking will be muted for the duration of the presentation, just so that this webinar can go along seamlessly and that the presenters will be able to answer all questions and be able to give their presentations without interruption. However, throughout the duration of the presentation, we'll have breaks for folks to ask questions. To that end, if you have a question that comes to mind, we strongly encourage you to write it in the chat, and then I will monitor the chat frequently, and I will post those questions to the presenters. So if you have any questions, again, feel free to write them in the chat, and we'll make sure that the presenters answer those questions for you. So to contextualize this webinar, I want to speak really briefly about our advocacy program. So at the center, we have an advocacy program called RiseOut, and it is a coalition that is comprised of over 35 organizations throughout every region of New York City. And basically, our work is to ensure that every person, be they LGBTQ or allied, is treated equitably and fairly in New York State. And a lot of our work evolves around mobilizing and organizing community members to make sure that we hold elected officials accountable and that New York State remains a LGBTQ friendly state. And a word about our Synergy sessions. So this webinar is a part of our larger RiseOut Synergy session series. And the goal of these webinars is to broach thoughtful, relevant topics that we care about. It is also an opportunity for us to partner with organizations who are on the ground, so to speak, leading on these efforts. And I will say that this Census webinar, which we're participating in today, is a microcosm of the work that we do. And it's basically designed, these webinars are designed to keep everyone informed, and it's also a way for us to learn together and to be able to walk away from these forums with tangible ideas on how to be leaders in our communities. And so, as you all know, we have a series of presentations, and I just want to take a brief moment to acknowledge all of our speakers who have dedicated a lot of time in compiling and creating these materials for your use. First, I want to thank Mita Anand, who is the Senior Fellow at the New York Immigration Coalition and New York Counts 2020. Secondly, we would like to acknowledge Juan I. Rosa, who is the Northeast Director of Civic Engagement at NALEO. Thirdly, we have Trevon Mayers, who is the Director of Policy and Community Outreach at the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Community Center. And last but certainly not least, we have Lori Favors, Executive Director at the Center for Law and Social Justice, all of whom will be speaking about census and the importance of census as it relates to those who have intersecting identities. And with that being said, I will now turn over this portion of the presentation to Mita.
Thank you so much, Trevon. I want to make sure you can hear me because I'm using my headset right now. Can people hear me?
We can hear you.
Wonderful. It is absolutely an honor to be part of this, especially alongside the esteemed group of presenters. As many of you know, because I recognize quite a few of the names along the top for Rain, I'm talking about you. We at New York Immigration Coalition have been working on the census for quite a while, since before the citizenship question, and definitely were very active during the citizenship question when we were one of the lead plaintiffs in the lawsuit that eventually got the citizenship question removed from the census. New York Immigration Coalition is also the facilitator and convener of New York Counts 2020. In both those roles, we view our role as equipping organizations to have effective census outreach in their communities. Next slide, please. I think that when people think of New York Immigration Coalition and the census, people might view immigrants and the census through a narrow lens. And out of conversations we've had with partners such as the center, it's very clear to us that, you know, as was already stated, we all have intersecting identities. And to just view how we approach the census as approaching it as an immigrant or approaching it as an African American or as a Latinx person does not really fully capture all the issues that one has or can face when dealing with the census. In particular, a lot of times when we're talking about the barriers that immigrants face in terms of completing the census, we often talk about things like, is there a citizenship question? Is there confidentiality? Is there language access? But I think a key component is a lot of times what immigrants are grappling with in terms of the census is, does it apply to me? Now, on that front, I'm talking about the fact that we import ideas from other aspects of our lives into the census. So people think, I'm not a citizen, therefore the census does not apply to me. Or I am not yet 18, the census doesn't apply to me. Or I don't have a visa, the census does not apply to me. Even more interestingly, we have found that sometimes people think the census does not apply to them simply because they interact with the government already. So for example, we've had questions like, well, if I'm registered to vote, then I don't need to fill out the census, right? Because the government already has my information. So this sort of like how you view yourself vis-a-vis your interaction with the quote unquote system affects how you view whether or not the census applies to you. Now, everyone on this call is a census advocate, so we all know that, yes, the census applies to all of us. But as census advocates, I think we need to be really mindful that people don't always even understand that most basic of messages, that it is for absolutely everyone. The next level of this is, does the census capture how I view myself? And I think everyone on this call knows what we're talking about on that front. So, Laurie, I know we'll talk more about this, but for instance, my mother is from Haiti. So when she first ever came across a census form, she didn't see where she, as a Haitian, fit into the categories that the census form had available at that time when she first saw it. And we'll talk about the example of the Sikh community in a bit. But when people are confronted with the categories that are constructed by government agencies, it doesn't necessarily apply to how they view themselves. And that makes it really hard for people because it forces people to make hard choices about how they want to self-describe. And as I stated before, these issues come across in many ways, such as what race, what ethnicity, what gender, and, you know, starting with this census, even white people have the ability to specify nationality, for instance, Irish background. So I think what we see here is that people, even though it's only 10 questions, it can really pose a moment for people to stop and grapple with how they want to self-describe. Next slide, please. One back, thank you. One slide back. Oh, you're right, sorry, my apologies. One forward. So what are our responses to these issues? I know that the other parties on this call will be talking about very specific areas of how to approach the census. But what I wanted to talk about before we get into those practicalities is the more general messaging around this. So even though the census doesn't always allow us to capture ourselves as we view ourselves, we need to make, however we identify, work for ourselves within the constraints of the census. So what do I mean by that? Part of it is what I call making the invisible visible. So for instance, our immigrant communities, by being undercounted in the census, do not show up in the data, therefore do not get the right amount of resources for their community. And by not showing up, they're invisible. So in order to claim power for their communities, in order to be acknowledged to be the numbers that they are, they need to be rendered visible. And the only way to do that is by participating in the census. Secondly, and this goes to the PowerPoint, it's a chance to participate in democracy. So for those who cannot vote for any number of a host of reasons, the census is that opportunity to influence democracy. Now, you might not be able to put the identity you'd prefer to put, but by increasing your opportunities for ensuring the representation for your community in a geographic sense, you ultimately are able to influence the levels of participation in democracy and how you are represented. And I'm going to give a few very specific examples of this on the next slide. How do you make identity work for you? So one example we have is that Grace Meng's district in Queens, Congressional District 6, her district, like all districts, was created based on census data. After the 2010 census and after the reapportionment and redistricting, her district was created, and as a result of the district that was created that has a huge Asian American population, she was then elected to Congress. So that is a group, that is an area of New York City that feels a close connection to who has been elected to represent them. And that is a power that came because of the ability for these groups, the fact that these groups were counted in the census. In Queens, we have Bengali ballots now. Now, how we got those ballots, it's a long story, but the shortest version is, in order to demonstrate the need to have ballots in Queens that were in Bengali, advocacy groups and legal groups pointed to underlying census data, which showed a high number of Bangladeshis in Queens of limited English proficiency. They needed that census data to advocate for, well, not even advocate, under law, based on the census data, these groups were entitled to the accommodation of Bengali ballots. What I have learned in the research for this webinar is that there were a number of groups that were just on the precipice of triggering the accommodation threshold to get ballots or other language accommodations in voting throughout the United States. The accommodation threshold being 5% of a district, and there were a number of groups that were just shy of that threshold. So if groups are able to be counted and to identify themselves as those groups, then these communities are then able to get these types of voting accommodations, and it makes a difference. For instance, the amount of voting by Bangladesh, Bengali-speaking communities in Queens has gone up, and that's not surprising. Finally, I think a lot of times when we're talking about the census, we talk about it in the like, how do we persuade people to fill out the census? And yet, if you think about the conversation we're having, people want to engage in the census. It's just a matter of like, they feel like it's not working for them. And the Sikh community wanted to be sure to be counted in the census. There is some debate around it because whether it's how they are being counted, since religion is not a question on the decennial census. But Sikhs have now been told that if they write in Sikh under race, it will be separately coded by the census, and they will be able to count their numbers. And this was the result of both an advocacy campaign from the Sikh Coalition, but not only was it the result of an advocacy campaign, like when the Census Bureau announced that it would be coding Sikhs separately, this was huge news that was making the papers in India. So I bring this up because by engaging in the process and in the census, it takes a while perhaps, but we're slowly able to open the doors to increased power and representation, not to mention resources. Next slide. So ultimately, the message is our voices are needed to build the future we want. So without being counted, we cannot advocate for the inclusive society we want to see in the future. And while we recognize the constraints that are there, we encourage everyone to both acknowledge that, but still encourage all of our communities to fill it out, because that is the only way that we are able to open the door for the more inclusive society that we want. Thank you.
Is this part open to questions? I know it's like right in front of me, but I'm just making sure.
Trayvon, do we want to take questions now, or do we want to do questions all at the end? Well, while we wait the answer to that question, I do see a question in the chat box that says, did I mention that religion is not being included? And that is correct. Religion is not one of the questions that is asked on the decennial census.
Sorry, everyone. I was apparently on mute. So we'll take one or two questions per presentation. But Mita, to your point, there was a question about religion. So thank you for asking that. There is, is there any other questions? Feel free to add it to the chat box. And if there's no questions that arise now, there will be ample amount of opportunity to answer towards the end of the presentation. There is one more question that we'll take right now from Kareem Sanchez. The question is, why was religion taking off?
I I I don't know if Julio or Lurie are aware that it was ever part of the decennial census. To my knowledge, it was never part of the decennial census. It is part of the American Community Survey.
Mhm.
Guys,
Yeah,
do you know any
that's
different?
what I would say. This is Julio, by the way, with Novello Educational Fund. Yeah, from what I understand, it's only part of the American Community Survey, which used to be known as the Census Long Form.
So in terms of Kareem and Reem, to your question, so what we are talking about is the decennial census, which occurs every 10 years, which is what we're all excited about right now. In the intervening years, there is, as Julio correctly said, something that used to be called the Census Long Form, is now called the American Community Survey, which has over 50 questions, which asks really detailed questions such as your education level, your income level, your citizenship, your religion. And that is used to come up with, to do statistical sampling and to come up with the more detailed answers to these types of questions that we reference in our work, in our day-to-day lives. The implications of not having it there, the short form census, the decennial census, is short for a reason. It's because it's capturing the basic demographic details that we that we want to capture. And for every question you add to the census, you decrease the response rate, basically. So religion sits at the American Community Survey level. The decennial census has really basic questions: age, sex, whether you rent or own, what your birth date is, who else lives in the household, and their age and sex and name. So, and their relationship to the main person filling out the census. Reem, I see you still have questions around advocating. I think at the end we can talk about like what it looks like to advocate what we believe the census should be for 2030. So I think we can put that part for the greater discussion because I think it's relevant in many ways.
Sorry, one last
Awesome.
question. Can you
if possible, can we hold that question to the end? We'll allot some time to answer that. We just want to make sure we give other presenters time to speak. So we will make time for your question towards the end. Make sure you write it in the chat, and we'll have Mita answer it. I guess segueing forward, we will now have Julio Rivera from NALEO speak about the work that their organization is doing to make sure that Latinx folks are included and prepared to fill out the census. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Julio.
Great, thank you so much. And so yeah, there's one quick correction to the program. It is not Juan Rosa, our Regional Northeast Director. It is myself, Julio Rivera. I'm the Northeast Census Campaign Manager for NALEO Educational Fund. If you don't know about NALEO, we are the nation's leading 501c3 nonprofit organization that is really promoting civic engagement at all aspects within the Latino community. So what does that look like? That's everything from naturalization, making sure that lawful permanent residents, green card holders become citizens, get registered to vote, exercise that right to vote. But as a foundation of all of that work is really the census. We've been running campaigns, working on making sure that Latinos are fully represented in the decennial census since 1990. This year, our campaign is called Hágase Contar. You may have heard of it. Hopefully you have. And we've been working over the past couple of years, really, in large, hard to count Latino-based communities. So here in New York, you can probably tell that is a high priority area for us. So a little bit of the history of what our topic at hand is today. So the Hispanic origin and race questions have a long history on the census form. NALEO Educational Fund has been working to reform and make this look a little bit more inclusive, so people can actually identify how they self-identify. In the modern day, the first time that a question asking about Hispanic or Latino origin was actually in the 1970 census. So this came about from years of advocacy work, pushing to get a question so we could get a better sense of what the Latino population looks like here in the US, right? With a growing population, advocates wanted to make sure that our communities were getting the resources and the political representation that they deserve. So 1970 actually, and just that long form, what's now the American Community Survey that we mentioned earlier, that's where it was included. Since then, it's gone through a number of changes to make it make a little bit more sense, make it easier for people to actually answer this question. After the 2010 census, the Low Educational Fund worked really hard, and so did the Census Bureau, to come up with a new form of asking this question. So to give everybody a background on what it looks like today and what it's looked like for a while, Hispanic origin and race are two different categories. So under the federal government, under the Census Bureau, Hispanic, Latino, Spanish origin, all these are considered an ethnicity. So under federal rules, there are two ethnicities, either Hispanic or Latino or not, right? Separately from that, the Bureau asks about race. So it'll ask if you're white, Black, of Asian American or Pacific Islander descent, or there's also a category known as some other race. So as you can, if you just start thinking about this, and we'll talk through this a little bit, you could see that there could be some issues with this, right? A lot of Latinos, a lot of Hispanic people do consider that origin to be part of the race. So the Bureau, recognizing this, recognizing how confusing these questions could be, did a significant amount of testing actually through the 2010 census, did numerous rounds of testing to try to reform this question, gather data to see how people responded to different formats, different ways of asking this question. The Low Educational Fund convened a number of stakeholder groups in both 2014 and 2017 to give feedback to the Bureau on this. Ultimately, our organization ended up endorsing what the Bureau was recommending, and what that looked like was a combined question. So instead of asking separately from ethnicity and race, combining both of these questions. I'm sorry, I haven't even really got into the slide, so we could actually just go back to the previous slide. But the idea would have been to ask this combined question, right? And giving people the fluidity and the options to choose between Latino, Hispanic, Black, Asian, and actually what would have been included would have been known as a MENA category, meaning Middle Eastern and North African descent. These categories to this day do not exist. Unfortunately, even though the Bureau endorsed these guidelines and the Low Educational Fund advocated for this new format, the OMB, which is an arm of the White House, decided not to move forward with these recommendations. And so for the time being, we're kind of stuck where we were back in 2010. And that's kind of what we'll go through today. So I think I get, go ahead.
Some folks are asking for you to speak a little bit louder. Is that possible?
Oof. May just be my headset, actually. I'm speaking pretty loudly. I don't know if this helps at all.
I hear you fine, but I'm not sure about the folks in the group chat.
Okay.
Thank you.
That was better, Julio.
Okay. I will hold it like this. Hopefully that works. Anyway, so as I mentioned, Hispanic origin and race are asked separately. Everybody will be asked to answer the question whether or not they consider themselves to be of Hispanic or Latino origin. A few different examples will be given, right? So some of the larger Latino groups, Mexican American, Puerto Rican, Cuban, these get their own checkboxes. For other Latinos, a few examples will be given, but those groups will have to actually write in what that origin is. So I'll use myself as an example. I'll check off, yes, another Hispanic origin, and I'll write in the country of origin as Salvadoran. Separately, everybody, including people that marked off yes as being Latino, will be asked to answer the question about race. So this will give people, under race, people can choose as many options as they'd like. So they can check all of the above if they'd like. Most Latinos will end up choosing some other race. We can move on to the next slide. One thing to note, though, under the Hispanic origin is that the Bureau will only recognize or will only report one origin. So this will create an issue for people with multiple origins. Let's say myself, I'm both Puerto Rican and Cuban descent, right? My parents are from 2 different countries, and so I would want to choose both of these. Unfortunately, the Bureau will only report one of those. So they'll actually choose which one of those that they'll want to report. We can move on to the next one. Separately for race, like I said, there have been some changes. White African-American will now allow for a country of origin. So there is some progress under white. People of Middle Eastern descent will be able to actually signify that. You can see they put the example of Lebanese and Egyptian. In the past, that wasn't there. So at the very least, there's some progress there in getting more accurate data in those MENA categories that we talked about earlier. For Afro-Latinos, this will be the opportunity to be able to designate that, right? So let's say I'm Dominican. I could write in yes, other origin, Dominican, and under race, I would be able to signify Black, and again, write in Dominican, and that's one way that somebody would be able to identify themselves as Afro-Latino. We can move on to the next. So again, I think you can, thinking through this, see some of the issues with this. Most Latinos do choose some other race or choose not to answer that race question at all. In fact, in the 2010 census, of everybody that chose some other race or that was Latino, that identified themselves as Latino, 97% of them indicated some other race, right? Give me just a second. Yeah, so from these projections, the Census Bureau is actually projecting that some other race will become the nation's 2nd largest racial group. So again, we're working to reform this. We're hoping that the 2030 census will be looking more like what the Bureau actually endorsed, what they did all that work on to try to make this a more fluid concept and a way of asking this question. But again, this is kind of a missed opportunity, but we do think it's important for people to recognize how important it is to actually fill out this information. Mita kind of alluded to this earlier, but she talked about it explicitly. But this information is important for protecting voting rights, for protecting civil rights. It's used for redistricting. It's used for employment and public contracting information. So all this information is highly important. We do realize some of the issues that people may have with, especially within the Latino community, with the way these questions are asked and identifying themselves. But we do ask people to really fill out these questions as much as possible, as best as they identify at least. And just this slide shows some of the briefs that we've released. There's actually a more in-depth webinar that I can share the link with a little bit later that our CEO, Arturo Vargas, actually leads on. So if you want to get a little bit more information on this, really actually more in-depth information on all this on this issue, I would highly encourage you all to check out those briefs. And we can move on to the next.
Next slide.
Next slide.
Which I think is just questions, so we can take questions at this point.
Thank you, Julio, for that informative presentation about how to get Latinx folks involved in the census. One question that arose maybe a couple of minutes ago was a question about lack of access to technological capabilities in light of the coronavirus. And I'm sure this is a broader question for everyone who is doing census work, but from your vantage point, what resources are out there for folks who might be adversely affected by this unfortunate situation?
So in terms of responding to the census, which I'm thinking is the basis of the question, people will be able to respond online, and yes, this will be the first time that it's available online. But we can't lose sight of the fact there's other ways that people can respond. People can phone in, they can call in. There's 13 different specific hotlines that people can call into in language. So if I am a Spanish speaker, there's a specific phone number that I can call to speak to somebody in Spanish and answer my questionnaire that way. 20% of the country, 20% of census tracts will actually receive the census form in a paper form from the very beginning. So their first mailing in low internet connection rate areas, maybe communities that are a little bit older, less familiar with technology, they'll receive that traditional paper form. Lastly, anybody that doesn't respond to the form in the first few weeks, by the fourth mailing that they receive from the census form, if they still haven't responded, they will get that paper form. So everybody will have the opportunity to fill out a traditional census form and mail it in if they don't fill it out in those first few weeks. Everybody still there?
Yep. Yeah, thank you, Julio, for that. There was a question, although it's not related to census, it might be important for folks who want to get involved with Naleo. Are there additional opportunities for community members to participate in census or Latinx engagement, broadly speaking?
Well, I would encourage people to sign up through our website, hagasecontar.org. You can actually take the pledge to help out on our campaign. Obviously, we are reassessing what that actually looks like moving forward at this point. I would also encourage you all, I sign up for the text message alerts. You can text either census or censo in Spanish to 97779 to receive text updates from us.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julio. Really informative. Next, we will have a presentation by Trevon Mayers about the census and its implications for New Yorkers who live in, or queer folks who live in New York State. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Trevon.
Thanks, Aaron. Can everyone hear me on the call? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you. So like Aaron mentioned, my name is Trevon Mayers. I'm the Director of Policy and Community Outreach at the LGBT Community Center here in New York City. Largely just reiterating what a lot of folks have mentioned, we have a dedicated census outreach campaign, particularly to add an LGBTQ lens to existing census work that's happening. And so we've taken it from the step of really talking about the census and the implications broadly, so understanding that the census impacts things like political representation, also programs, the social programs that our communities need, and then getting folks to understand sort of like what is critical about the implications of filling out the census or not filling out the census, but then also adding that specific LGBTQ lens. And when we talk about things like housing assistance, we want to make sure that we're adding the lens that almost 18% of LGBTQ people disproportionately need and use programs related to federal housing assistance. When we talk about census impacting funding, such as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, we want to highlight the fact that almost 23% of LGBTQ people receive SNAP funding. So really, is to take sort of like a bigger look at sort of like how the census impacts all of us, but then also making sure that we're adding the lens of just like when we're talking about money and funding and resources, we're actually thinking about people's lives. And what that translates to is that typically speaking, LGBTQ people disproportionately rely on a lot of the programs that census data or accurate census data will help them attain. Something that has come up consistently in terms of just conversations that I have had myself and other folks at the center have had with community members who are apprehensive or apathetic about engaging with the census is sort of like, does the census count LGBTQ people? And this is something that we really want to explicitly highlight and bring attention to, because the reality is that a lot of advocacy efforts over the last few years have been done to hopefully include questions that ask about gender identity and sexual orientation on the census, right? But we know that no previous census has ever included LGBTQ Americans. So it's really challenging because it means that federal agencies and researchers don't have data to accurately track the size, the demographics, and the needs of the community broadly. But we know that advocacy groups have been championing for these types of questions to be included on the census for decades. During the Obama administration, at least 4 federal agencies had recommended that these questions be included on the census. But then in 2017 concluded that there was quote unquote no federal need to ask about sexual orientation and gender identity on the census. And this is something that we often have to front in our own outreach efforts, right? But the reality is that when we're talking about the census and when we're asking ourselves the question, does the census count LGBTQ people? The answer is still yes. And the reason is that LGBTQ people, a lot of the times, in my work and in a lot of the work that we do at the center, we're constantly pushing against this idea that LGBTQ people are one kind of people or only care about one type of issue. And the reality is that LGBT people are represented in all demographics are typically hard to count communities. So there are LGBTQ people who exist within all of the different populations that are typically undercounted and underserved. That includes people of color, immigrants, Latinx folks, people experiencing homelessness, people living in rural areas. All of those people can be LGBTQ people. And so it's really important that we highlight that, because it means that if we're not advocating and participating in the ways that we need to, it'll be harder to get more inclusive and affirming questions in the future. So to that point, one of the things that we do a lot is really just highlight that we exist within all sectors of community. So a lot of our graphics that we have in the pipeline to share on social media is just sharing that simple message. LGBT people are immigrants, LGBT people are people of color. We all collectively make a difference in sort of like how a census count affects us. And understanding that, you know, this is sort of like a long game, and we know that the census as it currently exists is not affirming in the ways that we would like it to be, but knowing that it's through our participation and through our continued advocacy efforts that we will have the type of census that we want to see. Related to that, something that I definitely wanted to highlight here is that one of the first questions on the census is, are you male or female? And there is no option to identify along the gender spectrum. That's something that is definitely concerning to us. And so to the extent possible, we just ask that when folks are doing census outreach, they understand how to navigate questions like that, and making sure that even if the census form itself is not affirming in the ways that we would like it to be, that our own outreach efforts are. So making sure that you are affirming folks and their correct gender pronoun at every chance that you get. One of the things that we had talked about is passing out like a sticker that had folks correct gender pronoun on them when we do our own census outreach, because we know that this is something that is an understandable concern for community, and we want to make sure that as messengers of why we want folks to participate, we're actually making that process as affirming as possible. So if you'd like to learn more, definitely check out gaycenter.org/census. And you can pledge to be counted. You can have you can see an FAQ section about some of the things that we've gone over here, but wanted to just share that and share the perspective that we're approaching our own census outreach efforts.
Thanks, Trevon, for that insight into the work that the center and other LGBTQ organizations are doing across New York State to ensure that we are counted across our intersecting identities. If there's any questions for Trevon, feel free to enter it in the chat. Although I have a question myself. So we know that in the 2020 census, there's no question about gender identity. But I was wondering if you could speak to what the National LGBTQ Task Force or what other organizations are doing to make sure that we are making headway for 2030.
That's a good question. I think, so the National LGBTQ Task Force is one of the organizations that have really led on the census effort in being more inclusive and asking more questions about sexual orientation and gender identity on the census. And I think that really it's just a matter of plugging into some of their advocacy efforts. So I think Julio also mentioned that, you know, we're already thinking about Census 2030, and that is the truth. And part of that process, what will make that process as effective as possible is participating in the census right now. So again, this idea that if we want the census to be more affirming in the ways that we want it to be, in ways that speak to our community, we need to be doing like the long-term advocacy efforts to make sure that we're plugging into those campaigns, but we're also needing to do sort of like the shorter-term advocacy effort, which is just really sharing that message that participation is really crucial, because whatever happens with the census count will actually impact community for the next 10 years.
Great. And we have a question from Kareem. Aside from gender, questions of gender and sexuality, what are ways that we could further affirm folks who assume LGBTQ identities on the census?
That's a good question. I would say it's really just, so part of what the census is going to come down to is just who community members trust as messengers, right? And so I think equipping ourselves with the information that we need to be those messengers for community, because in certain spaces it will come down to folks having a good relationship with you and being being affirmed in that way, and being able to say that, you know, even though I'm engaging in a process that, you know, doesn't feel as affirming as I would like it to be, I know that you, as someone who is sharing this information with me, as someone who is doing census outreach, sees me and is acknowledging my identities. And so that gives me comfort in participating. So I don't want to downplay that piece of it, because I think that that's really what it will come down to, is really making sure that we're equipped with the information to be those messengers that the community really needs at this time.
Awesome. Thank you, Trevon, for that great presentation. And we will segue to the final presentation of this webinar. Lori Favors will speak about the Check Black campaign and the great grassroots work that they're doing over at the Center for Law and Social Justice to make sure that Black folks are counted in the 2020 census. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Lori Favors.
Hi, Trevon, thank you for that, Aaron. Are you guys able to hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so thank you. I just want to say one, thanks to you guys for organizing this. At the Center for Law and Social Justice, this is actually our 4th census campaign as an institution. And so we approached this particular census with a lot of trepidation and fear, primarily because we are quite clear about who is currently in leadership in this country, and a lot of the machinations and toying with the census that we saw early on with the attempts to create a citizenship question, which we know was really designed to strike fear in the heart of some of our most vulnerable communities. That really was something that we took into account. And as a result of that, in 2017, we created the New York City Black Leadership Advisory Coalition for Census 2020. And I see some of the members are actually here in the chat. And we created that as a Pan-African coalition that was really designed to speak to the multitude of identities that exist within the African descendant community. And when we say African descendant, we're essentially talking about everyone that Marcus Garvey was talking about when he discusses the red, black, and green flag, because we recognize that while we do show up in a whole host of different bodies, we also arrive in a host of different nationalities, ethnicities. And as a result of that, we wanted to make sure that we had the vehicle that would allow us to speak broadly to those communities. So what we did as a result of the New York City Black Leadership Advisory Coalition coming together was really work on creating culturally responsive messaging and materials. Some of you have heard me talk about this before, the fact that people of African descent, regardless of where our countries of origins may stem from, really do have a lot in common as it pertains to what that history looks like. And so the images that you see here, we introduced this group as the Jackson family. And the Jackson family shares a history that frankly is marked by racial terrorism and the institutionalization of white supremacy and the distribution of resources. And so this family, which is like any family within your community, which might live in any multi-unit building in your community, has parents, they've got children, they've got grandparents and uncles, all of whom may live in this same brownstone, for example, or a multi-unit building. And this family, because of a history that started in really, last year we celebrated the 2019, which is the 400-year commemoration of the introduction of the enslavement of African people in this country, which frankly was 100 years off because our Latinx brothers and sisters were experiencing that 100 years prior. But this is a family that knows that when strangers knock at the door, we typically do not have good things that happen as a result of that. And so, whether it's 400, 500 years ago, if strangers are knocking at your door, your village might find themselves at the bottom of a slave ship that night. 300 years ago, it might be that strangers coming to your door means half your family is sold away. 50 years ago, 10, 5, 2 years ago, 3 months ago, strangers coming to your door might say, hey, we're from ACS and we've been told that you're a negligent parent, when really it's that you are underfunded and underemployed. And as a result, your 10-year-old is taking care of the 3-year-old and the 2-year-old while you're working 2 jobs, but you've gotten a report for being a negligent parent. And so this history really lends itself to a lot of rational fear that communities of African descent have when it comes to participating in the census. Next slide, please. As a result of that fear, it would likely be that this is a community that lives in communities that are quite similar to many of us, where we have at best a 56% census rate. I had some of my interns doing remote research, and we were looking at communities in Brownsville, East New York, South Bronx that have a 20, 30, maybe a 40% census response rate. And because the census is essentially tied to the distribution of every financial resource that our community relies on, this is what these images for us represent what a 56% census response rate looks like. These are our schools, our grocery shopping options, our playgrounds, our transportation, overcrowded healthcare spaces, and the bottom right corner is supposed to be what accounts for healthy food. And so that history really comes into play because what we end up seeing is a desire to hide from the census within African descendant communities, which feeds the underfunding of resources within our communities. And because census is also tied to the distribution of political representation, it also means that instead of saying having 10 political representatives who can fight and advocate for us, we might have 4. And so what that means is we remain underfunded, we remain underpolitically represented, and then we don't even have the votes in our various halls of Congress or city council or state legislatures to fight for us to ensure that we're going to have proper access. Next slide, please. And we have to contrast that with other families and other communities. And so we often introduce this group as the Johnson family. And this is a family who, quite frankly, does not have that same racial history. They have a history that says, in the 1800s, 1700s, when the American government eradicated the indigenous population and broadly cleared indigenous people off of lands in the West, they told families like the Johnsons that they could go out West. They could have 5 acres of land. They could build a farm. They could have a house, and literally really allowed them access to the first forms of affirmative action and turned them into landowners and homeowners overnight. This is a family that knows that when grandpa or grandma came back from the war, they were not going to be racially redlined into artificially created ghettos that were going to ensure they could not use their preferential veterans loans to get mortgages that would allow them access to housing. They knew that they would be able to use their GI Bill and would not be blocked out of educational pursuits. And so the Johnson family, which has the same structural makeup as the Jacksons. They've got parents living on one floor with children. They've got grandparents on another floor and then aunts on a third. This is a family unit that essentially is going to have 3 census forms, whereas the Jackson family might have 1. the Jackson family might have one census form that counts a quarter of the children and doesn't include any of the other folks who are in that home. And so that Jackson family, because of their fear, are going to be locked into perpetual poverty, while the Johnson family is going to be able to access political power to ensure that they are continually able to receive the benefits of resources. And so for me personally, I live in Bedford-Stuyvesant. And I have children who live and who have grown up in Bedford-Stuyvesant. They go to school in public schools. And I have to explain to them that when you are walking down the streets in our community and you see trash everywhere, it's not because our community is inherently dirty. It's because we don't have trash cans except one every 3 or 4 blocks. Whereas if I go down to Park Slope or Upper West Side, I'm going to have a trash can on every single intersection at every single corner. Why? Because that community knows how to access the resources and political power that is going to ensure they have the physical apparatus to keep their communities clean. When we look at subway stations in Brownsville and East New York, or the South Bronx, or South Queens, or Jamaica Queens, you're going to have subway stations that smell like someone has literally just used them for the bathroom. Whereas if I go to subway stations in the Upper West Side or in very white areas, they're going to have beautiful mosaic tile that look like artists just came in overnight and redid them. And that also is tied to those resources. When we think about right now, what's happening with the public health crisis and the fact that hospitals that tend to be shut down and healthcare services that tend to be shut down are typically shut down first in the most vulnerable communities, when those communities don't have the population counts to justify the investment of resources in their community, that also is a census justice issue. And so you can go to the next slide, please. What that means is the Johnsons are going to be living in a community that's going to be very, very physically different than the communities that the rest of us live in. They're going to have access to education services, healthcare services, playgrounds, and healthy food options that simply is not there for the rest of us. And so when we're engaging in outreach, we rely heavily on images, we rely heavily on culturally responsive messaging in order to get our communities to fill out the census. Now, what this means in this current time is, well, at one point we had a very vibrant outreach campaign, a physical outreach campaign that was planned, where we were targeting every Black-owned barbershop, hair salon, daycare center, and faith-based institution in each of the hard-to-count communities within Black spaces. Now we're doing that digitally, and we're tapping into Black influencers, Pan-African influencers who are going to be able to use their digital platforms to leverage a message about getting us to submit the census and hopefully taking advantage of that online option. Next slide, please. One thing that's extraordinarily important for us is to be clear about the fact that the census is not a place for having moral quandaries about identity, right? And the reason we say that is because, as I think it was Trayvon who mentioned earlier, the way in which gender is a binary choice that doesn't recognize the multiplicity of identities within our communities, that also shows up in the area of race. And so the census is really one of those spaces where we are squeezing square pegs and trying to fit them into round holes in ways that do not actually align with who we are and how we show up in our real lives. That said, it is imperative that we are able to recognize that and inform our community so that they can be as sophisticated and as strategic as possible when it comes to completing the census. So as Julio mentioned earlier, the issue of race is one of those areas, and we encourage people to participate in our Check Black campaign, because for the first time, people of African descent are not going to have to choose between identifying as a national origin and race. They will be able to do both, and that really is a result of a whole lot of advocacy. And to one of the folks who had a question in the chat earlier about how we can advocate to get questions changed in return as it pertains to religion, advocacy around questions on the census really is a multi-year long process. The MENA category, the Middle Eastern North African category that people were advocating for years, they're on their 2 decades into advocating for that type of question to be added. And so we really do have to be thinking not just about 2020, but 2030 and 2040. And one of the things that's important is that as it pertains to the intersection of identities racially, if I am multiracial, it's important to know that biracial or some other racial category is not a protected racial category, which means that you are not going to be able to invoke for your community the anti-discrimination protections, the civil rights protections, the voting rights protections, all of which require you to identify racially. So when I go into court, you know, if I were talking to Mita's mom, and Mita, you mentioned that your mom is Haitian, it's a wonderful thing and a very important data point that we know that there are Haitian Americans in our community, and how many of them are there, so that I can fight for Haitian Creole to be one of the resources or one of the languages that election materials are printed in, for example. It's important. However, Haitian is not a protected racial category. So if our Haitian community members are not also indicating Black, they are essentially diluting themselves from the racial protections, such as they are, and trust, they are not phenomenal, but such as they are, from being able to access in that community. Another place we see this happening positively was in 2010, our Dominican American brothers and sisters were able to have an on-the-ground, door-to-door campaign that encouraged everyone to not just identify as Latino or Hispanic, but to indicate that they were Dominican. And that really was instrumental in not only getting an additional 5 schools built in that district in the years following 2010, but it also was able to allow them to elect the first Dominican American congressman. And so these are the types of real-world examples that can come when our communities are empowered to know how identity works on the census and are able to then use that for their own sophisticated strategic community outreach and organizing. I encourage everyone to visit our website, which is clsj.org/censusjustice. There we have a host of information and materials that you can look to. Prior to the current public health crisis, we had a form that one could fill out to request printed materials to be printed for you. We have a poster campaign and a palm card campaign, and ideally we would be printing those for you and making them available for pickup. Unfortunately, our offices, as many of yours, are now closed for the foreseeable future, but we do have digital downloads available that we encourage you to take to make a part of your own campaign. We are really focusing now more on texting, phone calling, and digital social media organizing, but in that stead, we encourage you all to visit the website and access those materials. And if you have any questions, you can contact us there as well.
Awesome, Lori. Thank you. One question for you in respect to filling out the census if you have a criminal justice involvement. So a lot of people, particularly in New York State, who have the identity of a Black person may have had some sort of criminal justice involvement. How would you recommend advocates navigate advocating for census for those communities who might have some apathy towards government institutions, generally speaking? Because I would imagine folks who may have distrust for government might be less inclined to fill out the census.
Absolutely. Well, I think it really goes back to how you opened up this presentation. With all of us, the census is for all of us. And the reality is that if you have a criminal justice involved background, you need access to those resources just like everybody else. In fact, some would say you need access to them even more so. In 2010, there was a lot of advocacy around ensuring that the count for people who were incarcerated upstate would be attributed to the communities from which they came. And that was successful on the New York State level, but that's a New York State entity. And so that's something that we would hope that our brothers and sisters across the country would take on so that we can put an end to prison gerrymandering. But what that means is that if you have people who are incarcerated, or who have that background, they need to know that the information on the census is protected and no private individual data is distributed. So your landlord isn't going to know, your employer isn't going to know how you identify. What is important is that they are very clear that every single person, whether they have a criminal justice background or not, has got to be counted, because that's the only way we can ensure that reentry programs, that job placement programs, that programs that can be specifically targeted to folks with that background are going to be able to be implemented within the community.
Awesome. Thank you, Lori. It seems as if we're running out of time, but there's one more important question that I would like to frame to Mita. So earlier during the presentation, someone asked if there was a way that we could mobilize Arab communities in particular around census. And Mita, I want to know if there's sort of like a a quick response you had to that, but it was definitely a question that I wanted to make sure was answered.
Sure. So I would refer the person that came in, oh, that was Reem. Yeah, I would refer them to Yalla Count Me In, which is the Arab American campaign that is being run around Census. So their messaging is absolutely fantastic, and they have wonderful memes, which unfortunately in this day, as Laurie mentioned, we're relying on a digital strategy at this time. And because we're relying on a digital strategy, it's really important to seek the culturally appropriate messaging, even though we've moved digital to a digital world. And Yalla Count Me In is a really great one for that type of messaging for the Arab community.
Awesome. Thank you, Mita. So in terms of, I guess, ongoing work that's happening from the perspective of the center, given that we'll be doing a lot of our work digitally for the foreseeable future, we encourage you to stay connected via mobile. So to that end, you could text RiseOut, which is one word, to 69866. Again, that's RiseOut, one word, to 69866. It appears as if we're at the end of this webinar, but I want to take a moment to thank all of our co-sponsors and presenters for lending their expertise and speaking about the census, because it has important implications for all communities, and I hope that you found this informative. This webinar will be available for viewing on YouTube as well as on our website, which is gaycenter.org. So if you're interested in revisiting this webinar, you can go to our website, gaycenter.org, and you could watch it there. And last but not least, we want to thank all of you for taking the time out your day to be involved in this webinar, and we thank you. So that concludes our webinar. Have a great day.
Thanks so much.